"Sergeant, did you forget to clean your uniform? Or is that dirty patch supposed to mean something?" The question cut through the hallway outside Memorial Hall at Fort Ashland, sharp enough to stop the quiet movement of officers, families, and invited guests preparing for the Raven Ridge Survivors ceremony. Sergeant Abigail Monroe did not turn right away. She stood near the entrance in a pressed dress uniform, polished shoes placed evenly on the marble floor, dark blonde hair pinned neatly beneath her service cap, her white face calm beneath the soft gold light from the hall chandeliers. Everything about her appearance followed regulation except the field patch on her left sleeve. It was dark blue once, maybe, but years of sun and weather had faded it almost gray. One edge was torn. A dry brown stain marked the lower corner. At the center, a white star with a broken upper point still held its shape, stitched so many times that the thread looked like a scar. The young officer who spoke, Lieutenant Carter Mills, stood with a clipboard against his chest and the careful confidence of someone who had never learned how heavy a small piece of cloth could become. A few people glanced at the patch, then at Abby. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked irritated, as if she had brought dust into a sacred room. Commander Nathan Brooks heard the comment from near the memorial arch and turned with the expression of a man who believed every detail of this day mattered. He was 42, white, square-jawed, clean-shaven, and exact in the way he wore his uniform. Brooks had spent 3 weeks preparing the ceremony. Every chair aligned, every flag measured, every name card checked twice. The survivors of Raven Ridge were coming to this hall to be honored, and he intended the room to look worthy of them. Then he saw Abby's sleeve. His eyes narrowed, not with cruelty, but with the certainty of command meeting something out of place. "Sergeant Monroe," he said, walking toward her, "is that patch authorized for today's uniform?" Abby finally looked at him. Her gray-blue eyes were steady, almost tired, but not disrespectful. "Yes, Commander." Brooks stopped close enough to see the dirt embedded in the fabric. "Authorized by whom?" "By the people who gave it meaning." Lieutenant Mills shifted beside him. "Sir, it looks like it came off a field pack." Abby's fingers touched the patch once, lightly, the way some people touch a medal, or a photograph, or the last thing someone handed them before morning. "It means enough," she said. The hallway went quiet again. Beyond the open doors, Memorial Hall waited with its rows of polished wooden seats, framed unit flags, and a wall of names carved in pale stone. Inside were survivors, medics, pilots, families, and retired service members who had traveled from across the country for a ceremony built around memory. To Brooks, memory deserved order. It deserved discipline. It deserved clean lines and clean uniforms. He looked at Abby and lowered his voice. "This is not a field exercise. This is a memorial ceremony. Everything worn here should honor the room." Abby's posture did not change. "It does." The answer was simple, but it did not satisfy him. Around them, people waited to see whether she would explain herself. She did not. She only stood there, beautiful, composed, and quiet, wearing a patch that looked dirty to everyone who had never needed to follow it home. Commander Nathan Brooks waited for Sergeant Abigail Monroe to explain the patch, but she gave him only the same steady silence that had unsettled better men in harder rooms. The hallway outside Memorial Hall remained suspended around them, polished marble underfoot, framed photographs along the walls, the low murmur of guests fading behind the open doors. Abby stood with her shoulders squared, her dress uniform neat, her shoes polished, her service cap aligned, and that old field patch fixed to her left sleeve like the one detail she would not surrender. Brooks looked from the torn edge to her face. "Sergeant, I am not questioning your service. I am questioning whether this is appropriate for the ceremony." Abby's eyes did not move. "Understood. Then you understand why I am asking." "I understand what you see." Lieutenant Carter Mills shifted his clipboard and spoke before wisdom could stop him. "With respect, ma'am, the room is full of survivors and families. A patch that looks like it was dragged through a training field does not send the right message." Abby turned to him then, slowly. Mills held her gaze for 1 second, then looked away first. Not because she threatened him, because there was nothing careless in her eyes. Only memory. Brooks noticed it, but he still saw a problem he believed he had to solve before the doors fully opened. The Raven Ridge Survivors ceremony was not a routine event. It marked the anniversary of a recovery mission that had become part of Fort Ashland's history without ever being fully discussed in public. The official program used careful language: severe weather, broken communications, difficult terrain, successful return. It left out the long hours, the confusion, the waiting families, and the people in this very hall who still carried that night in quiet ways. Brooks had treated every visible detail with reverence because he believed that was how honor was protected. Flags pressed. Aisles clear. Uniforms correct. No loose threads. No distractions. Then Abby had arrived carrying the one thing he could not make clean. "If the patch has significance," he said, his tone more measured, "you can submit it for display after the ceremony. For now, I need you to remove it or replace the jacket." Abby's hand settled lightly over the blue cloth. "I cannot do that. Cannot, or will not. Both." The word moved through the hallway like a closed door. Mills inhaled sharply. Brooks kept his voice low, but command hardened beneath it. "Sergeant Monroe, this is a formal memorial event. Refusing a reasonable uniform correction in front of guests puts me in a position I do not want." Abby nodded once. "Then I will stand outside." That answer surprised him more than defiance would have. She was not trying to win the argument. She was willing to lose her place in the ceremony before removing the patch. Behind Brooks, two senior enlisted guests slowed near the doorway, drawn by the tension. A woman in a dark civilian suit looked at Abby's sleeve and frowned with uncertainty. Inside the hall, a microphone gave a soft test hum. The ceremony would begin soon. Brooks glanced toward the room, then back to Abby. "You would miss a ceremony honoring Raven Ridge over a piece of damaged fabric?" Abby's expression stayed calm, but something in her voice lowered. "It has been where clean things did not last." Mills gave a small, uncomfortable laugh, the kind people use when they do not know they are standing near grief. Some people confuse dirt with honor. This time, the hallway did not merely go quiet. It emptied of air. Abby heard him. Brooks heard him. The guests near the doorway heard him. Abby did not answer. She only adjusted her sleeve so the broken white star faced outward, as if preparing to carry it away from the room that had not recognized it. Then she stepped back from the entrance, choosing silence over explanation, and for one brief moment Brooks believed he had preserved the dignity of the ceremony. He had no idea he was about to learn that the dignity had been standing in front of him the entire time. Abby Monroe took one step away from the entrance, and the movement should have ended the matter. Commander Nathan Brooks had given a uniform correction. The sergeant had chosen to stand outside, and the ceremony could continue with its polished program and perfectly aligned chairs. That was how Brooks saw it for the first 2 seconds. Then the doors to Memorial Hall opened wider, and the room inside began to notice her. The hall was filled with people who carried Raven Ridge in different ways. Retired medics sat beside former pilots. Older service members rested both hands on canes polished from use. Families held folded programs against their chests. Some wore dress uniforms that still fit with effort. Others wore dark suits, quiet dresses, service pins, or small ribbons clipped to lapels. The room did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a place where years had passed, but certain nights had not. Abby stood just outside that room with the broken white star facing outward on her sleeve. She did not look into the hall at first. Her eyes stayed on the marble floor, not in shame, but in restraint. Brooks watched her and felt a flicker of uncertainty. She had not argued like someone trying to protect pride. She had not asked for special treatment. She had simply refused to remove a damaged patch and accepted exile from a ceremony where many would have wanted recognition. That kind of choice did not match carelessness. Inside the hall, the first survivor to see the patch was an older man seated near the front row. He had white hair, a navy blazer, and a folded program trembling slightly in one hand. His name card read Thomas Harlan, Raven Ridge Recovery Group. He had been speaking softly to the woman beside him when his eyes shifted toward the doorway. At first, he only glanced at Abby. Then he stopped moving. The conversation around him continued for half a breath before the woman noticed his face. "Tom," she whispered. Harlan did not answer. He stared at the patch as if the hallway had pulled something out of a place he kept locked. Slowly, carefully, he pushed both hands against the arms of his chair and stood. The movement was difficult enough that 2 people near him reached to help, but he waved them off without taking his eyes from Abby's sleeve. Brooks turned toward him, confused. Mills lowered his clipboard. Abby heard the chair legs shift against the floor and finally looked up. Harlan's voice came thin but clear across the hall. That is the star from the ridge. The words did not sound dramatic. They sounded disbelieved. As if he was seeing a sunrise he had once promised himself was impossible. Brooks looked from Harlan to Abby. "Sir." Harlan stepped into the aisle. "The broken star," he said, his eyes still fixed on the patch. "Blue field. Torn top point. I followed that patch through smoke and rain." The hall quieted in layers. First the front rows, then the center, then the back, where families turned to see why the program had stopped before it began. Abby did not move. The composure she had held in the hallway remained, but her hand lowered from her sleeve as if the patch no longer belonged only to her. Harlan took another careful step. "I thought I would never see it again." Lieutenant Mills looked smaller now, the clipboard pressed too tightly to his chest. Brooks felt the first clean fracture in his certainty. He had asked who authorized the patch. He had not asked who remembered it. Abby's voice was low when she finally answered. "I wore it the night we found you." The sentence moved through Memorial Hall without needing volume. Harlan closed his eyes for 1 second, and when he opened them, he stood straighter than his age should have allowed. Around him, other faces began to change. Recognition did not arrive all at once. It moved row by row, like light crossing a field after a long night. The first person to stand after Thomas Harlan was a woman in the second row wearing a dark blue suit and a small medical service pin on her lapel. Her hair was silver now, cut short, her posture careful, but when she saw the broken white star on Abby Monroe's sleeve, her hand moved to her chest as if steadying something that had never fully settled. "I remember it," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the hall had become so still that every word carried. "That patch was the first thing I saw when the rain cleared." Abby looked toward her, and for the first time since entering Fort Ashland, the silence around her did not feel like judgment. It felt like memory finding witnesses. Commander Nathan Brooks stood near the memorial arch, caught between the ceremony he had planned and the truth unfolding without permission. He had built the mourning around order, but this was not disorder. This was recognition. Another man stood near the center aisle, younger than Harlan, but moving with the stiffness of someone who had carried pain longer than he admitted. "She kept turning back," he said, looking not at Brooks, but at the patch. "I did not know her name then. None of us did. We just knew to follow the star." The words moved through the hall like a slow current. A retired pilot in the back row rose next, then a former communications specialist, then a nurse who covered her mouth with one hand before standing fully. They did not stand quickly. They stood with effort, with age, with old injuries, with grief, with gratitude, each one rising as if the patch had called them by name. Lieutenant Carter Mills took one step backward. The clipboard in his hands lowered until it hung useless at his side. His earlier words remained in the hallway like something spilled and impossible to pick up. Some people confused dirt with honor. Now he was watching honor stand up all around him, and it looked exactly like the thing he had called dirty. Brooks felt his throat tighten, but he did not speak. Not yet. Speaking too soon would have made the moment about him. Abby remained at the doorway, still half outside the hall, as if she did not know whether she had been invited in by memory or trapped by it. Her face stayed composed, but her eyes had changed. They were not colder now. They were more exposed. Harlan took another careful step down the aisle. "We were told later that the recovery team had markers, lights, signals, procedures," he said. "Maybe that is what the report said. But what I remember is a woman in the rain pointing us toward the route, and that broken star on her sleeve every time she came back into view." The woman with the medical pin nodded. "I remember her counting people, not speeches, not medals, just making sure nobody was left behind." Abby's hand tightened once at her side, then relaxed. Brooks saw it and finally understood the weight of her refusal. She had not protected the patch because it made her look brave. She had protected it because it held pieces of people who had survived and people who had waited. It was not dirt. It was witness. More survivors stood now until nearly every person from the Raven Ridge section was on their feet. Some held canes. Some leaned on spouses. Some stood straight with tears they did not wipe away. No command had been given. No protocol required it. The hall simply rose because the truth had entered wearing a faded blue patch. Mills whispered, barely audible, "I did not know." Abby turned her head slightly toward him. "That is why you ask before you judge." He looked down, and for once, he had no quick answer. Brooks stepped away from the memorial arch, crossed the short distance to Abby, and stopped in front of her. The room watched him now, but he kept his eyes on the broken star. He had thought the patch failed to honor the room. Instead, the room had just stood to honor the patch. Commander Nathan Brooks stood in front of Sergeant Abigail Monroe with the entire Memorial Hall watching, and for the first time that morning, rank gave him no easy place to hide. The survivors remained on their feet behind him, not in perfect military alignment, not because a command had been given, but because memory had pulled them upright. Their faces held years of distance from Raven Ridge, yet the sight of the broken white star had brought that night back with a clarity no program booklet could contain. Abby did not look past Brooks toward them. She kept her eyes forward, calm and controlled, as if allowing herself to meet every grateful face at once might cost more than she was willing to show in public. Brooks lowered his gaze to the field patch. Up close, the details he had judged as careless became something else entirely. The torn edge had been stitched by hand. The dry stain at the lower corner had never been scrubbed out because someone had chosen preservation over appearance. The white star was not perfectly shaped anymore, but that imperfection had made it recognizable to people who had once searched for it through a long and uncertain night. Brooks drew a slow breath. "Sergeant Monroe," he said, his voice carrying into the hall, "I owe you an apology." Abby said nothing. She did not rescue him from the discomfort. She did not make the moment smaller for his sake. Brooks accepted that. "I called this a uniform issue," he continued. "I treated it like a distraction from the ceremony. I did not understand that this patch was part of the reason the ceremony exists." Lieutenant Carter Mills stood several feet away, face pale with embarrassment. Brooks glanced toward him, not to shame him, but to include him in the lesson he should have taught earlier. "I also allowed a careless comment to stand in a place built for remembrance. That was my failure." The hall remained silent, not cold, listening. Brooks turned back to Abby and straightened. Then, in front of the survivors, the families, the officers, and the guests, he raised his right hand in a formal salute. It was sharp, deliberate, and without performance. Abby held his gaze for 1 second before returning it. The motion was simple, but the room changed when she did it. The apology had restored protocol. Her return salute restored dignity. Thomas Harlan remained standing in the aisle, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. "Commander," he said, "that patch led more people into this hall than any invitation you mailed." Brooks nodded, accepting the correction without defense. "Yes, sir." The woman with the medical service pin added, "It was never dirty to us." Abby's hand moved once toward her sleeve, stopping just short of touching it. "It was not meant to be seen today," she said. Her voice was low, but the room leaned into it. Brooks looked at her. "Then why wear it?" Abby's eyes moved across the survivors now, slowly, carefully, giving each of them the respect of being recognized without being named. "Because some anniversaries do not belong to the clean version of the story." No one answered. They did not need to. The flags at the front of the hall stood perfectly still. The polished chairs, the framed photographs, the carved names on the pale stone wall, all of it suddenly seemed less complete without the damaged patch at the doorway. Brooks stepped aside and turned toward the entrance. "Sergeant Monroe," he said, his voice steady now, "would you do this hall the honor of entering first?" Abby looked at him, then at the survivors still standing. For the first time, the control in her face softened enough to show the burden beneath it. She did not smile. She only nodded. As she stepped into Memorial Hall, every survivor remained standing, and the broken white star on her sleeve passed between them like a quiet promise that had kept its shape long after the night that gave it meaning. Abby Monroe walked into Memorial Hall first, and the room did not sit until she had passed the front row. It was not planned that way. No master of ceremonies announced it. No protocol officer guided the timing. The survivors simply stayed on their feet, watching the broken white star move down the center aisle with the same quiet focus they had carried years ago when that patch had meant direction, hope, and the possibility of going home. Commander Nathan Brooks followed several steps behind her, but for once he did not mind being outside the center of the room. This ceremony had never truly belonged to him. He had organized it, measured it, polished it, and scheduled it, but Abby's sleeve had revealed what he had almost missed. Remembrance was not created by clean lines. It was carried by people. Lieutenant Carter Mills stood near the entrance, his clipboard lowered at his side. When Abby passed him, he straightened, not out of fear of rank, but out of shame that had finally become respect. Abby did not look at him long. She gave him a small nod, enough to acknowledge the lesson without reopening the wound. Mills swallowed and whispered, "Sergeant." It was not an apology yet, not fully, but it was the first word he had spoken that morning without arrogance. Abby continued forward. Thomas Harlan remained standing as she neared his row. The woman with the medical service pin stood beside him, one hand pressed lightly against her program. A retired pilot in the back lifted his chin. A former communications specialist closed his eyes as if hearing old rain against a roof only he remembered. None of them spoke now. Their silence had become the language Brooks had tried to arrange with speeches and printed cards. Abby reached the front of the hall and stopped beside the memorial wall. The names carved into pale stone rose behind her in straight columns. Above them hung the flags Brooks had inspected twice before sunrise. Everything was correct. Everything was clean. Yet the room's eyes were on the torn patch, because it was the one thing present that had not been cleaned into distance. Brooks stepped to the microphone, looked down at the prepared remarks, and knew they were no longer enough. He folded the first page and set it aside. The sound of paper moving across the podium seemed louder than it should have. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but changed. "This ceremony was prepared to honor the survivors of Raven Ridge. I believe that meant presenting this hall at its best. I was wrong about what best meant." Abby did not move. Brooks looked toward the rows of standing survivors. "The best of this hall is not the polish on the floor or the alignment of the chairs. It is the people who came home, the people who helped them come home, and the truth that some marks on a uniform are not stains. They are proof." The hall stayed silent for one beat, then another. Brooks turned from the microphone and faced Abby. "Sergeant Monroe, thank you for carrying what the rest of us almost failed to recognize." Abby's hand touched the field patch at last, not to defend it, not to hide it, to steady herself under the weight of everyone finally seeing it. Then she looked at the survivors and gave the smallest nod. Only then did they begin to sit, slowly, carefully, row by row, as if lowering themselves back into the present from a memory they had all entered together. Brooks watched them and understood that the ceremony had not been interrupted. It had finally begun. The ceremony continued in a different room than the one Commander Nathan Brooks had prepared. The walls were the same, the flags were the same, the program still listed the same names in the same careful order, but something beneath the ceremony had shifted. It no longer felt like a polished event built to remember hardship from a safe distance. It felt like the people of Raven Ridge had brought the truth into the hall and placed it gently beside the podium. Abby Monroe sat in the front row only because Brooks had asked her to, and because Thomas Harlan had looked at the empty chair beside him with a quiet hope she could not refuse. She sat straight, hands folded, field patch visible on her left sleeve, the broken white star resting under the warm light as if it had always belonged there. Brooks spoke less than he had planned. He read the names of the survivors, thanked the families, and honored the recovery teams, but he no longer tried to polish the memory until it became easy to hear. He let silence do some of the work. When Thomas Harlan was invited to speak, he rose slowly, accepted help only after pretending he did not need it, and walked to the microphone with the careful dignity of a man who had waited years to say one simple thing. "I do not remember every face from that night," he said, looking across the hall. "That is the truth. Time changes the edges of memory. Fear changes them too. But I remember that patch." Abby lowered her eyes for a moment. Harlan continued, "I remember seeing that broken star ahead of us and thinking, if I can still see it, we are still moving in the right direction." The woman with the medical service pin wiped at one eye, but did not look away. A retired pilot in the back nodded once, almost to himself. Harlan turned slightly toward Abby. "You did not ask us to know your name. You did not ask us to thank you. You just kept making sure we were still there." Abby's jaw tightened, barely enough for Brooks to notice. She remained still because that was what discipline had taught her to do when emotion tried to step into public view. Lieutenant Carter Mills stood along the side wall with no clipboard now. He had set it on a chair, as if paperwork had become the least useful thing in his hands. He watched Abby the way young officers watch a lesson they wish they had learned before failing it in front of witnesses. When Harlan finished, he did not ask for applause. He simply turned from the microphone and gave Abby a small salute, imperfect in angle but perfect in meaning. One by one, others followed from their seats, not all standing this time, not with ceremony, but lifting hands to hearts, lowering heads, giving small gestures of recognition that belonged to no manual. Brooks watched Abby receive it without taking ownership of it. She did not smile like a celebrated hero. She looked like someone accepting responsibility for a memory she had never stopped carrying. When the last speaker stepped away, Brooks returned to the microphone and looked at the patch again. Earlier, he had thought the stain made the uniform less honorable. Now he understood that the uniform had become more honest because of it. Some service is recorded in files, he said. Some is remembered by those who made it home. Abby looked up then, and for the first time that day, Brooks saw gratitude in her eyes, not for praise, but for accuracy. The hall stayed quiet, and the broken star remained visible, no longer questioned, no longer defended, simply understood. After the final speaker stepped away from the microphone, Memorial Hall did not move back into ordinary ceremony. It remained quiet in a way that felt chosen, as if everyone understood that applause would have been too small for what had just been remembered. Commander Nathan Brooks closed the program folder on the podium and let the silence stand for a moment longer. He had spent 3 weeks planning what words would fill this room, but the most important truth of the day had arrived on Abby Monroe's sleeve before anyone invited it to speak. Abby remained in the front row beside Thomas Harlan, posture straight, hands folded, eyes forward. The broken white star rested under the chandelier light, no longer looking out of place against her dress uniform. The patch still had its torn edge. The dry stain still marked the lower corner. Nothing about it had changed, except the people looking at it. Lieutenant Carter Mills stood near the side wall, watching the survivors gather their programs and speak softly among themselves. He had not picked up his clipboard again. When Abby rose from her seat after the ceremony, he stepped into the aisle, then stopped himself, unsure whether he had earned the right to approach. Abby noticed. She always noticed more than people expected. She turned toward him. Mills swallowed. "Sergeant Monroe," he said, voice low, "what I said earlier was careless." Abby waited. He took the silence as permission to finish. "No, not careless. Disrespectful. I saw something I did not understand and tried to make myself look smarter by making it smaller." Brooks, standing several feet away, heard the words and did not interrupt. Abby looked at Mills with the same calm expression she had carried at the doorway, but now the room understood that calm differently. "Do you know why uniforms matter, Lieutenant?" she asked. Mills straightened. "Because they represent discipline, ma'am." "Partly." Her hand touched the field patch. "They also remind us that we are never only wearing ourselves." Mills looked at the broken star, then at the survivors still standing nearby. "Yes, ma'am. Then remember this. Some parts of a uniform are inspected by regulation. Some are inspected by history." Mills lowered his eyes. "I will remember." Abby gave him a small nod, enough to end the lesson without making it gentle. Across the hall, Thomas Harlan approached with slow steps, the woman with the medical service pin beside him. Harlan stopped in front of Abby and looked at the patch again, not with shock now, but with gratitude that had settled into something steadier. "I never knew your name," he said. "Not then." Abby's voice softened. "You were not supposed to need it." "Maybe not," Harlan said, "but I am glad I know it now." The woman beside him reached into her program and pulled out a small folded photograph, old and slightly faded. She held it toward Abby. It showed a group of survivors years earlier, wrapped in blankets near a recovery vehicle, faces tired but alive. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was a sleeve with a broken white star. Abby looked at it for a long time. The hall around her seemed to fall away. Brooks saw the moment touch something deeper than praise. The photograph did not glorify the past. It proved that the people in the room had not imagined their memory. Abby handed it back carefully. "You kept this." The woman nodded. "For the same reason you kept the patch." Abby looked at the torn cloth on her sleeve, then at the survivors who had stood for it. "Some things are not dirty," she said quietly. "They are carried." No one answered right away, because some sentences do not need response. Brooks watched the words settle into Memorial Hall, into the polished floor, the stone names, the folded programs, and the hearts of people who would leave that day seeing honor differently than when they arrived. By late afternoon, Memorial Hall had emptied slowly, as if no one wanted to be the first to leave the room that had changed them. Families moved through the aisles with folded programs in their hands. Survivors paused near the stone wall of names, tracing letters with their eyes instead of their fingers. Officers spoke in quieter tones than they had used that morning. The flags still stood in perfect order, the chairs were still aligned, and the marble floor still reflected the soft gold light from the chandeliers. But Commander Nathan Brooks no longer believed those details were what made the hall sacred. He stood near the entrance where the misunderstanding had begun, watching Sergeant Abigail Monroe prepare to leave. She had returned to the same place where he had stopped her hours earlier, but nothing about the space felt the same. Lieutenant Carter Mills approached her one final time, not with a clipboard, not with nervous authority, but with both hands at his sides and his posture corrected by humility. "Sergeant," he said, "thank you for letting me learn before I became the kind of officer who stops asking." Abby looked at him for a moment. "Keep asking the right way." Mills nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He stepped back, and this time he did not look at the patch as something strange. He looked at it as something entrusted. Brooks waited until Mills left, then walked to Abby. The hall behind them had grown nearly silent. Thomas Harlan and the woman with the medical service pin stood near the front doors with a few other survivors, speaking softly to one another, glancing back at Abby, as if making sure the broken star was still there. Brooks stopped beside her, not in front of her this time. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. Abby adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. "You can ask." The Memorial Hall archive preserves artifacts from Raven Ridge. Programs, unit flags, recovery maps, personal letters. If you ever wanted that patch protected here, I would make sure it was placed with honor. Abby looked down at the torn blue cloth. The white star was worn almost thin where years of weather and handling had softened the thread. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Brooks no longer mistook that silence for refusal or pride. He waited. Abby finally touched the edge of the patch with 2 fingers. "Not yet." Brooks nodded slowly. "May I ask why?" Her eyes moved toward the survivors near the door. "Because some memories still have to be carried." The answer did not sound sad. It sounded like duty. Brooks understood then that the patch was not finished doing what it had always done. It still gathered people. It still corrected assumptions. It still pointed the way for those who had forgotten what honor could look like when it returned from difficult places. Abby stepped toward the exit, and the remaining survivors turned as one. No one saluted this time. They did something quieter. Harlan placed his hand over his heart. The woman beside him bowed her head. One by one, the others followed, not to elevate Abby above them, but to acknowledge that she had carried a piece of their return longer than any official record. Abby paused at the threshold. The evening sun outside Fort Ashland touched the glass doors, turning the hallway amber. For the first time that day, her face softened fully, not into a smile of victory, into the quiet relief of someone whose burden had finally been seen without being taken away. She looked back at Brooks. "Commander," she said, "not every mark on a uniform needs to be cleaned." Brooks stood straighter. "No, Sergeant. Some need to be understood." Abby gave a small nod and walked out into the evening with the field patch still on her sleeve. Behind her, Memorial Hall remained polished, ordered, and silent. But now it held a different kind of dignity, one no inspection could measure. The broken white star was not in a glass case. Not yet. It was still moving through the world on the arm of the woman who had earned the right to carry it.